Welcome to the food episode. Did they make you hungry? Not only did they put the McDonald's in this episode, but the key lime pie as well, and they reversed it. They did a backwards dinner. Have you ever heard of a backwards dinner? I actually heard of it a few years ago before the pandemic, and I tried it out at Serendipity 3, where that is the place to do a backwards dinner if you're going to do one, because the desserts are so fantastic there. But I was surprised. Having your dessert first did not detract from having dinner second. You should give it a whirl sometime. Did you give it a whirl today, or did you just eat your food in the regular order? And I know some of you are planning to get McDonald's and or key lime pie to go along with Loki. So how did that work out? I'd love to hear it. Although, wasn't that the proppiest key lime pie you ever saw? And then they wouldn't even really eat it. Tom Hiddleston was pushing it all around the plate. I wonder how many takes they had to do, but still, I'd be like, you guys, you actually each have to take a bite. I'm sorry. Or cut it in from the first scene where they took a bite. It was hilarious. All right, everyone gives Belle a hard time, but these guys weren't eating either. But by the way, episode 2, food aside, does this season keep getting better and better or what? Who thought they could keep up the quality of episode 1, which many of us agree is superior to the entirety of season 1, which was already good. So you're like, they can't. I knew they kept it going because I had already seen the first 4 episodes, and they keep going and they keep going. But I'm sure some of you are like, they can't possibly do it again. And they did. But there's also more feels this episode. Some people said that episode 1 of season 2 felt like the conclusion to last season's finale. And I can see that critique. I don't even know if it's really a critique, but some of you felt season 2 hadn't really started. But how do you feel now? Oh, I feel we've started. And to me, this episode is special and exciting because it does what we always hoped Marvel Disney Plus shows would do, what we were promised they would do. And that's allow us a deeper dive into already established characters, particularly the fan favorites who are the supporting characters in the movies and therefore don't get as much time. The characters we noticed and we're like, we'd love to know more about that character. And Kevin Feige said, that's what we can do with Disney Plus. And at first they did that marvelously. And even recently, the Hawkeye show did that to a degree. It was a little overcrowded by introducing another Hawkeye simultaneously, but I felt I got to know more about Jeremy Renner's Hawkeye for sure. But I think overall, recently, Marvel has forgotten that excellent original mission statement. But they've remembered it here. Here, Loki is allowed to be Loki again. Instead of trying to hide that villainous part of himself, so many people have been like, Loki's not the same. Loki's been neutered. How do you feel about him today? This was fantastic. So instead of trying to hide that villainous part of himself, and the show doesn't just say he can have his pie and eat it too. He still has to live with that, to work with it, which I think is really sophisticated. And we're going to talk about all that in this breakdown. But, also we see why he and Mobius are such a good match, because Mobius is a little bit of a villain himself. I love that. But Mobius also is such a positive, upbeat, and forward thinking. Remember last episode? He's like, forget the shoulda, woulda, coulda. What's happening right now? That's very much how Mobius is. So he's the type of person who can overlook Loki's, let's say, issues. But is that healthy? We see Mobius break here, so maybe it's not entirely healthy. I love it. But first, did you understand what happened during this episode? There's a bit of a time jump from the end of last episode, and a few things are never really fully explained. And it's interesting because I watched the first episode 3 times. I watched it once, first as a screener just to experience it for review. Then I watched it again to do my notes for the breakdown, and then I convinced my parents to watch it. They didn't care for it. But when I was watching, did you convince any casual fans to get in to watch this? What was their reaction? So anyway, while I was watching it with my parents, I was like, I bet this is hard for them to follow. And it was hard for them to follow, although part of them also just didn't care anymore, to be honest with you. I think they're just marveled out and it's too much and the quality hasn't been as good. And I'm afraid this show just couldn't bring them back in. So I'm sad about it. But, they said they appreciated me wanting to share it with them. It reminds me of when I was little and I used to have them show them cartoons I was really into. And I was like, I'm still doing it as an adult. And they're still not into it. All right, but they do love that I love it so much. All right, so I do think that this show is a bit inaccessible, unless you're like really into it, or you have a show like this to help you out. So I'm going to give you a brief rundown of the plot of episode 2, just to make sure we're all on the same page and you totally get what's going on before we dive into the details. And if you're like, I know, Grace, I know what's going on, well, let's go. Let's see. Let's test it. Let's see if you agree with my explanation. So it turns out that General Dox and her mini army of sympathizers are going to prune the new branches themselves. They're like, to heck with this ruling from episode 1. We're going to prune ourselves with like time bombs and just blow up the branch timelines. But Dox still feels that finding Sylvie is important. She has answers everybody needs to know. So Dox sent the very experienced top-notch hunter X5, who I think is a dope. But apparently he's good at his job, although I came to like him this episode quite a bit. Oh, we're going to talk about X5. But X5 was sent to find Sylvie on his own. And he did find her, because he's a very good hunter. And they never really explained why he did this. Maybe seeing Sylvie have a real life inspired him to go find his own. The combination of seeing Sylvie living a life and B-15's speech from last week. But instead of taking Sylvie to Dox, he left her alone and he went AWOL himself and found his original life on the timeline, 1970s movie star Brad Wolfe. Now, this is pulled from a very obscure Marvel comic. Zaniac was actually it wasn't a movie and it wasn't an actor. It was a character who had a real life affliction, which wasn't funny. But here this used to be the idea for a movie. So they don't really do anything with it. They're not really pushing for anything. It's just a cute little Easter egg. But I appreciated it, and it sure was fun when we saw them filming. We were like, oh, that's from the comics. We love it. All right, so at the beginning of this episode, Mobius and Loki are following the only lead that they have, the last ping from X5's tempad before he went dark, and they feel that he must be searching for Sylvie if he's missing, right? And they know he's close with Dox. So if they find him, they'll find Sylvie. And that's the setup, okay? All right, now, what an opening sequence. Oh, it was wonderful, and I loved that it all came before the title card. Oh, so good. It was as good as a movie, in my opinion. I loved it so much. And by the way, literally night and day with the horrible, sloppy, lazy, flat fellow urban chase sequence also taking place in the UK area in Secret Invasion. I was like, it's so similar, yet you can see the disparity and how Loki is just so far above in terms of quality. I mean, Secret Invasion, they were ashamed before, but this is just another reason that they should be ashamed of that show. How did they have this going through the Marvel pipeline at basically around the same time, right? And not be like, hey, Secret Invasion team, here's what you're turning in, and here's what Loki's turning in. Are you sure you want to go with this? But we know that Marvel doesn't like to show people other projects that are going on, even if they relate to theirs, Multiverse of Madness, and that seems to be a real bad policy. All right, so this chase sequence didn't have a lot of locations either. They were basically running in a circle. But that's okay. They were extremely well used and extremely atmospheric. I was like, oh, are Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Jack the Ripper here? I'm loving it. Director Dan DeLoe, who I've never heard of before, did a fantastic job this week. What a director. And once again, Natalie Holt's score is a key component to what makes this show really cook. What I particularly love about this sequence, again, I love how Loki-centric this episode is, but this sequence starts out in that we see Loki in the field, in control, not on the run like he was last season, right? Now he's the hunter, and it feels good, as evidenced by his fantastic swagger in that shot when he comes down the alleyway with glorious purpose. That's the way I've said that I've found myself walking sometimes. You get a good heavy leather boot, you get yourself a nice outfit you feel cool in, you can really move. Oh, I loved it. Mwah! It was so beautiful. I related to it. I was in awe of it. I was so happy for Loki. So yes, he's allowed to be his trickster self, the god of lies, very much a theme this episode. Even doing his own version, I love this, of the classic street con. He's a con artist, they're on the street, a shell game. Which of the three is the real Loki? And even Mobius guessed wrong, because the episode was in on it and gave us a misdirect. Oh, I thought that was so clever. I love that it's a shell game. I love that. X5, aka movie star Brad Wolfe, though, has some tricks of his own during this chase sequence. With this altered TVA tempad, which B-15 very cleverly takes. So I love her ruse. She's like, can I get your autograph? Wham! She slaps a lot harder than Mobius. And then also, though, X5 has a wrist version of the TVA neck collar, which has the time twister where he can rewind himself. And he rewinds himself to an earlier point in the chase where he's back up top out of the tunnels, and he goes from there. I thought that was a very clever use of that. But again, some people might not make the connection because it's been a while since season 1, and it was just a little obscure, I think. But it's very cool. But X5 is no match for a god, and after years of Loki being the small one, with Thor the muscle between the two of them, isn't it fun to see Loki be the muscle for Mobius? I was like, oh, this is a new role for Loki, and I love it for him, and he loves it for himself. Now, it's not just fun to watch Loki be mischievous, but so it's fun. This sequence is fun for that reason, and it's a very good action sequence, but the episode is, I don't think, by the way, I could see some people being like, should Tom Hiddleston be James Bond? No, he's Loki. He fits for Loki. I don't think he has the wiry frame and the mess of black curls that Loki has. I don't see him, and I don't really like Tom Hiddleston with red hair. I think he should always have black hair, quite frankly. Sorry, Tom. But I don't think he's Bond. All right, so, and Bond would never wear a pirate shirt underneath his tuxedo. Oh, it's funny. All right. But the importance of this opening sequence and showing Loki being bad again is that it sets up the interrogation scene 1, where Brad uses that against Loki, trying to turn what Loki is feeling really good about, a plus, into a minus. Let's discuss this brilliant scene. Although, side note, considering Sylvie just enchants the info out of Brad later on, why did Loki just do that right away? Well, remember, magic doesn't work in the TVA. But then take him to an offsite. Why did they keep him up top in 1977 London and just interrogate him there? They got to be careful about stuff like that. That was the one sloppy thing in the episode where I was like, you undermine two brilliant interrogation sequences. Okay, let's talk about them. All right, so yeah, Loki is feeling good. He's not only a TVA agent, but he's a darn good one. But in their first run at X5, aka Brad, Mobius warned them that Brad can get under your skin, and Brad does. And actor Rafael Casal, who apparently was on the timeline long enough to grow his hair out from episode 1, I was like, what was the point of that? But the actor here really stepped up. Loki is the villain you want to root for. You're like, come on. So what a great idea to pit him against a smarmy jerk that nobody can stand. You're like, they're like, oh yeah, I'm definitely rooting. Like when Loki went up against Mobius, you're like, don't hurt Mobius. But here you're like, you do what you need to do, Loki. But it turned out great. And, so Brad, he turns out to be quite the verbal sparring partner. The lives at stake speech, where Loki's like, lives are at stake. And Brad's like, really? You're going to use that with me? So that Brad throws that back at Loki was just incredible. This was like Hannibal Lecter levels of psychological warfare. He goes right for Loki's greatest fear, that Loki can't be a good guy. He'll never be wanted or admired and appreciated because Loki is always the problem and he always makes things worse. That's been a chip on Loki's shoulder since he was a boy. And Brad even uses the variance to say, you think you're special, but this is always what it's like for you, and it's always what it's like for Loki's, and there's no escaping it. So your future Loki cannot be changed. That's a big deal to Loki's. That was the whole thing about season 1, that your future isn't written. That also meant a lot to Sarah Connor in Terminator. As I told you before, I carved no fate into my piano bench growing up. It means a lot to me as well. But anyway, I love the line where Brad says, or X5 says, the lies you tell your friends, the lies you tell yourself. And of course, Loki is the god of lies. But against his friends, against himself, again, can Loki not change? And then Brad clearly has, no regard for his welfare, his personal welfare, because then he plays the mother card. Oh, I love when he apologized for that later. But remember, Loki's mother is the only member of Loki's Asgardian adopted family. It was a trade with the Frost Giants. Adopted is a nice word for what it was. But the only person growing up and when he was an adult that Loki ever truly loved. And she was killed, and Loki couldn't save her. So that's a real sore point, as you might recall from season 1 as well. And so, as Mobius says, such an intense sequence, so intense. And Tom Hiddleston and the whole room actually really sell it. because the episode doesn't take the approach of, and this is brilliant, the directing doesn't take the approach of, oh, well, Brad's lying, he's being mean, this isn't true. But instead it says, maybe Brad is right. Maybe this is true. Oh, I loved it. And that not only sets up the brilliant second interrogation scene so that we get scared there, which we'll get to in a minute, but it does two things for Loki as a character overall. It allows Loki to retain his Lokiness. He doesn't have to get rid of it, which was what made the character so popular in the first place. And then it's realistic, so it rings true. It feels earned. People can adjust. I think that's true. But that doesn't change their past or instantly get rid of the parts of them that made them do bad things in the first place. So just like someone who's wrestling with their demons in real life, this fictional Norse god, he can want to be good. He can even be good. But he'll have to always answer for his past and wrestle with his demons for the rest of his life. And for Loki, that's a very long time. So I just think that's really well handled. And, it also shows that Loki might be a Norse god and a Marvel character, but he's still like the rest of us. And, repentance is hard and it never ends. I loved it. But that's not to say he can't still use his villainous aspects to his advantage. If you're going to have them, you might as well get some use out of them. Oh, so good. Not only as a bluff, right, in second interrogation scene, but to bend the rules as much as he can throughout this show. That's great. And the second interrogation scene, by the way, only works as well as it does, building off of the first interrogation sequence where you had to believe that maybe this was true, because the second half only works if even we believe that if pushed hard enough, even new good Loki would still kill Brad. I thought he might the first time I watched it. I was like, this isn't looking good for you, Brad. I mean, that was just excellent. The face, voice, and eye and physical acting from Tom Hiddleston, oh my gosh, it was just, I was eating it all up like they weren't eating that pie. And then, you know what makes it even sweeter? That Mobius is willing to take that risk. Because I said Mobius has a bit of villain in him. And I mean, he was willing. I think, maybe Loki would snap. Maybe he would squish Brad. And then Mobius would be like, oh well. And he'd just, shake it off the way Mobius does and just continue to be positive and forward thinking. Don't shoulda, woulda, coulda it, right? And I wonder if this part of Mobius will be reflected in when we do discover what his life is like on the timeline. And that's not a spoiler. I haven't seen an episode where that's covered yet. So I really want to know what Mobius was like. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we break down this episode. So Mobius, right? He goes good cop with Brad with a very real and funny threat. I love that knock-knock joke. Brad who? That's showbiz. Nobody remembers who Brad is, right? Oh, that was a great joke. That was really good. Knock-knock jokes are hard to do and not make them lame. That was fantastic. But yeah, Mobius is pointing out that if Brad cooperates, he'll take him back to being a movie star. But if he doesn't, well, then Hollywood will just move on without Brad Wolfe, because Hollywood is real mean like that. Oh, that was great. But then Brad, feeling pretty good having shaken up the god of mischief, decides to go for Mobius's jugular. And he succeeds because he's asking him, he's like, Mobius, why don't you want to know what your life is like on the timeline? Huh? And the question makes Mobius so upset that he slaps X5. It was an open-handed slap. I was going to say that he bitch slapped him, but I replayed the tape, and I don't think that it qualified as a bitch slap. It was an open-handed, private school scuffle slap, which I thought was hilarious. But for Mobius, it was a big deal. So yeah, this is why Loki has to be, I guess Loki and Mobius are like tough guys for private school, which I think is hilarious, having, that experience myself. That's so funny. All right, so I love that Loki was genuinely concerned about Mobius, by the way. Not judging, because he's done awful stuff too. And that Loki's take on the first Avengers movie was glorious, right? Remember that time I got really mad at my father and brother and I had like a really bad day and threw Tony Stark off a building? That was me just losing my cool as well. That was fantastic. And again, the delivery was just so fun. This is a little bit sometimes like Despicable Me. It was just great. Mobius, though, explains, he comes clean and he says he doesn't want to know what his life was like. Because and Loki's like, maybe it was awful and then you won't have to feel bad about it. And Mobius says, but what if it was great? Now, here's the thing. Because the TVA can travel through time to any point, Mobius, if he did live a great life on the timeline, could go right back to where he left it. He doesn't have to have missed any of it. So the fact that he's so worried makes me wonder what's going on here. I really want to unlock the mystery of what Mobius is really like. And there has to be something about him that makes him a match with Loki. Was he like stealing jet ski money or something? Was he like maybe that's what it was. Maybe he was like a sleazy salesman. Maybe he lied a lot. These are just my guesses. But there's got to be something about him that makes him truly a better match with Loki than like Thor. I'm really curious to find out what it is. All right, so interrogation scene 2. Wow, the TVA does not mess around down there that they even have a device like that, which uses time door technology to create a box. What's in the box? You are! And that size of the box is controlled like some weird 1970s video game, as effectively demonstrated by Loki when he crushes that metal stool. This scene was even more tense than the first one, and it was so delicious. Again, that's the word for this episode. Delicious and glorious. When Loki threw X5's hateful words right back at him. Oh, this was so great. He says, "Oh, Brad, haven't you heard? I've done terrible, horrible things." And I was like, that is so fantastic. Loved it. And that only works because you have to believe that Loki truly would do terrible, horrible things again. And I do. I honestly do. I mean, he didn't here, but I believe that's still in Loki, which is what makes the character, I think, so interesting and exciting. And again, Mobius is okay with it. I love them. All right. Then, of course, the other big scene this week, McDonald's. Delicious. I love that they're showcasing the McNugget, which of course in this, because of the time they're in, was just introduced, but it's also my favorite of the McDonald's, entrees. All right, so anyway, we see that Loki truly loves Sylvie because he's able to get past her new mullet hairstyle. That's love. Woo! At first I couldn't understand why Sylvie was so upset with Loki. I was like, shit, didn't she recently kiss him goodbye? I think a little bit of her would be happy to see him. So the joke answer is that she's having a bad hair day. And she's like, of all the days for him to show up here and be reunited with me, this has, that's what her hair looks like that day. I thought that was funny. But then when I watched it the second time to do my notes, I was like, I think she's upset because basically her ex-boyfriend is now working for the place that destroyed her life and which she tried to destroy in return, and that she thought they were destroying together. It's like they were activist freedom fighters, and then he goes and gets a job with the system, right? Like they're anti-Vietnam, and then he goes and joins the CIA. That's kind of what I would say it's like. So then I start to understand where Sylvie's coming from a little bit better. But Loki is changing the TVA, right? Where it's no longer about protecting the system, but the people in that system. Not prioritizing the sacred timeline, but valuing all the timelines. And you'll note the distinction in what's a branched timeline and what's part of the sacred timeline in the lower thirds. Pay attention to that. However, Loki also says, though, that everyone needs order to protect them from chaos, which is why Loki doesn't want to totally get rid of the system. He just wants to use it for good. Whew, that's a fine line. That's a slippery slope. All the metaphors, Loki, and very sophisticated, and an interesting discussion of law enforcement and government. And that's pretty cool for Marvel. That's when I love Marvel the most, when they use comic books to have this type of discussion. All right, and I love when all comics are like that. Marvel, DC, it's great. It's what comics are. They used to be like. Comics are not that great these days. But back in the day, comic books, the actual comic books, were always this sophisticated, and that's why they were a joy to read. And that's why so many of us were like, don't disparage comic books. They're brilliant. All right. Now, I loved Mobius's line where he's like, I thought you were setting us up for an ambush. Instead, you were setting us up for a great meal. And speaking of great meals, is Mobius eating just apple pie and french fries and maybe a milkshake? Ha, Mobius, you're out of control, man. You got to get a protein in there. But anyway, I loved Mobius genuinely asking Brad about Zaniac. He's like, no, really, it looks scary. And then Brad's like, it's art, you wouldn't understand. I thought that was great. And I also loved the two of them gossiping about Loki and Sylvie's relationship. I was like, oh, what's going on at this table? I love it. It was very much a little bit, speaking of school, like a lunchroom. But then Mobius realizes that Brad is just a little bit too eager to get off this branched timeline. And so they're like, we're not taking you out of here. Brad almost cracked, but in fact it was Sylvie who got everything out of him through the enchantment. But they finally find out what Dox is up to, that she's going to prune all the new branched timelines, including the one they're on, which means they're all in danger. So that leads the way to an very rushed action sequence at the end of the episode, where Loki, Mobius, and Sylvie are back together again. Although this time, I was even more aware than last season of there being two Lokis. I was like, oh, it really does feel like there are two Lokis this time. Dox, though, is surprisingly easy to defeat, and the altered Tempads very easily written off. So what was the point of having this all happen? Well, our trio stops her, but not before she does prune a number of the new branched timelines. So that tragically buys our heroes, or really anti-heroes, more time before the temporal loom overloads. Because remember, last episode, OB said they had just 5 minutes. But now that Dox has brought the number of branched timelines down, or at least momentarily, because I think they're going to keep branching and new ones will branch out every time a variant does something, right? But at least they bought some time for the season. So I think that's the point of what they did. Also, Sylvie can't help herself. I love that she followed Loki back to the TVA. And seeing their very genuine reaction of horror to all these pruned branch timelines, I think gives Sylvie the glimmer of hope that maybe Loki's right. Maybe the TVA can be different. Maybe the TVA can be used for good, right? But she's still not sold quite yet. So the Beast, that's why she leaves. And goes back to McDonald's. I hope she's just not eating McDonald's food all the time. Maybe because she's a god, she can take it. But anyway, the B storyline this episode is that while OB is making some progress on how to fix the temporal loom, love pairing him up with Casey, by the way, who's a big fan of the handbook, asking OB to sign it. But OB can't get into the system to reopen the blast doors that he closed last episode to fix the temporal loom, to get access to it, without Miss Minutes online, because Miss Minutes is the only one who can override the system, or they have to get the temporal aura, that's the key, of the person who built the TVA, which is He Who Remains. He didn't seem very tech savvy to me when we met him, but whatever. Maybe he just liked medieval fantasy as a style, or what was that, like Renaissance? I wonder how, I guess it was maybe a little Renaissance. All right, so anyway, that makes sense for Kang, a Renaissance man. I just got that. I love that. They should play that up more. But anyway, since He Who Remains is dead, that means they need a He Who Remains variant. You don't say. Interesting. And on that note, who just popped up in the story? Why it's Renslayer. They finally get a lead on her. Her Tempad pings, and it turns out she's the last message they could decipher from her Tempad was a message from Miss Minutes, which means that Renslayer and Miss Minutes are working together. And Loki already knows that Miss Minutes was working with He Who Remains. And Loki also found out last episode that Renslayer was working with He Who Remains. So this seems like a group that's forming, right? So is Renslayer running from the TVA, or is she running towards something else? We'll see. The race is on next episode. I'm so excited. It's another banger. And it feels so different than this week's. We're going to have such a good time. If you wanted something for next week, I would recommend Cracker Jacks if you want to theme your food with the episode. All right, so what did you think of episode 2? What do you think of the big, bold strokes, and what do you think of the nuances? And what do you think of what they're doing with Loki and Mobius? Share those thoughts down below. What'd you think of Brad? I think Brad is fantastic. I actually, at first I thought he couldn't act, but I actually think he's great. So share your thoughts down below, subscribe today, and of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.